It was May 28, 2026, a Tuesday, and on the surface, nothing happened. No press conference, no presidential address, no dramatic announcement that would make the evening news. Instead, the United States Department of Commerce quietly updated a PDF file on the Federal Register website, A, Revised Export Control Rule. The language was dry, bureaucratic, the kind of thing only trade lawyers and lobbyists usually read. But buried inside that document was a bombshell that would ripple through boardrooms in Silicon Valley, research labs in Shenzhen, and strategy rooms in the Pentagon. The United States was easing restrictions on advanced AI chips destined for China. Think about that for a moment. For nearly 4 years, the U.S. had been tightening the screws. The narrative was simple. Starve China of the most advanced semiconductors, and you cripple their artificial intelligence ambitions. Keep them 2 generations behind, and American technological dominance is secure. It was a policy built on the assumption of permanent leverage, that we could turn the tap on and off at will. So why, in 2026, did the U.S. government suddenly turn the tap back on? The official reason, buried in the Commerce Department's statement, was a phrase that should have made everyone sit up straight: evolving technological parity and national security recalibration. Parity. The U.S. government was admitting, in the most carefully worded way possible, that China had caught up, that the restrictions had not stopped them, that the strategy had, in a very real sense, failed. And that admission leads us to a story that is not about trade policy or tariff codes. It is a story about a woman, a coffee mug, and a hard drive that changed the balance of power in the most important technology war of the 21st century. Her name is Dr. Mei Lin. And until 2024, she was one of the most important engineers at Huawei's semiconductor division, the high-silicon unit that was the crown jewel of China's chip ambitions. She led the team that developed the Ascend 910B, Huawei's flagship AI training chip. She knew exactly how far China had come and exactly how far they still had to go. But in 2024, she did something that put a target on her back. She defected to the United States. Now, defection stories are usually simple. A person gets on a plane. They land in a new country. They talk to intelligence agencies. But Dr. Mei Lin's defection was different. It was a heist. By the time she walked out of Huawei's Shanghai campus for the last time, she was carrying the equivalent of a nuclear warhead in data. 2 terabytes of chip design files, production roadmaps, and internal performance benchmarks. And she smuggled it out in a coffee mug. Let me be clear. This was not a novelty mug with a false bottom. This was a custom fabricated device. A thermal mug that looked completely ordinary, but inside its insulated walls, machined into the stainless steel, was a slot for a solid-state drive. The drive itself was encrypted, and the encryption key was not stored electronically. It was a pattern of physical holes drilled into the mug's inner wall, readable only under a specific wavelength of light. This is the kind of tradecraft you see in spy movies, except it was real, and it happened in 2024. Dr. Mei Lin walked through security, past the guards, past the facial recognition cameras, with the equivalent of Huawei's entire chip design philosophy in her hand. She took a domestic flight to a coastal city, then a private boat to a U.S. Navy vessel. And within 72 hours, she was sitting in a secure room at the Pentagon, pouring out 2 terabytes of secrets to analysts who could not believe what they were seeing, because what she told them contradicted everything the intelligence community had assumed. For years, the consensus in Washington was simple. China's semiconductor industry was a paper tiger. They could design chips, but they could not make them. They relied on Dutch lithography machines from ASML, American design software from Cadence and Synopsys, and Japanese chemical suppliers. The 2022 export controls were designed to cut those supply lines. The assumption was that without access to extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV, China would be stuck at 14 nanometers forever. That was the bet. But drive. Mei Lin showed them the receipts. She showed them that by 2024, China's largest chipmaker, SMIC, had already achieved mass production of 7-nanometer chips using entirely domestic lithography tools. Not as efficient as ASML's machines, but functional. The yield was lower, the cost was higher, but the chips worked. And more importantly, she revealed that Huawei had stockpiled U.S. and Dutch equipment before the sanctions hit. They had bought 3 years' worth of spare parts, maintenance kits, and even entire lithography machines that were disassembled and stored in warehouses across central China. The sanctions did not stop production. They just delayed it by about 18 months. And by the time the stockpiles ran out, China's domestic tooling industry had already crossed the chasm. Her most stunning revelation came in a briefing on September 1st, 2025. She told Pentagon analysts that China's 5-nanometer pilot production line was already operational, not experimental, not a lab curiosity. A real, running production line that was churning out test wafers. The gap between U.S. and Chinese chip technology was not 5 years. It was not 3 years. It was 2 years. And that gap was closing faster than anyone in Washington had predicted. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because if you were in the U.S. government in late 2025, you had a choice. You could double down on restrictions. You could try to blockade every route, close every loophole, and hope that China's domestic industry would eventually stall. Or you could look at the data, do the math, and realize that the restrictions had become self-defeating, that they were not slowing China down, they were accelerating them. And that is exactly what a leaked internal memo from the Commerce Department, dated February 10, 2026, concluded. The memo, which was obtained by The Intercept, said in blunt language that continued restrictions were accelerating Chinese self-sufficiency at a rate that exceeds our modeling. In other words, the more we squeezed, the faster they built their own alternatives. Now, let's pause here and look at the evidence chain, because this is where the mainstream view and the alternative view collide. The mainstream view, championed by groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, says that the restrictions are working, that China's progress is overstated, that they are still reliant on smuggled technology, and that without American design software they cannot produce competitive chips. They point to the fact that Huawei's latest chip, the Ascend 920B, still uses a modified ARM architecture. They say it is a copy, not an innovation. But the alternative view, backed by independent analysts like SemiAnalysis, tells a different story. In March 2026, SemiAnalysis published a report titled China's Chip Independence, Reality versus Hype. They concluded that while China is not yet at the absolute frontier, they have crossed the threshold of good enough. Their chips are not 100% as efficient as NVIDIA's best, but they are 80% to 90% as efficient. And in the world of AI, 80% efficiency is transformative. It means you can train large language models. It means you can run inference. It means you can build autonomous driving systems. It means you can compete. And this is where Dr. Mei Lin's data becomes the smoking gun. Because when Stanford's engineering lab independently benchmarked the Huawei Ascend 920B against NVIDIA's A100, they found it performed at 92% efficiency on standard AI workloads. 92%. That is not a copy. That is a competitor. And it forced the Pentagon to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. The sanctions had created a Sputnik moment for China. Let me explain what I mean by that. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The U.S. was shocked. They had assumed American technological superiority was absolute. That shock galvanized a generation of investment in science and education. It created NASA. It created DARPA. It created the Apollo program. The U.S. response to Sputnik was not to try to block Soviet rockets. It was to build better ones. China's response to the 2022 chip sanctions was exactly the same. The sanctions were a national humiliation. The Chinese government used them to justify a massive, coordinated, state-directed investment in domestic chip production. They poured billions into SMIC. They created a national champion in Huawei's chip design division. They funded university programs, poached talent from Taiwan and South Korea and built an entire ecosystem from scratch. The sanctions did not cripple them. They gave them a clear enemy and a clear mission. By early 2026, the U.S. intelligence community had to admit that Huawei's AI chips matched the performance of NVIDIA's A100, which was the gold standard just 3 years earlier. And a leaked Pentagon cost-benefit study from April 2026 put the numbers in stark terms. The full restrictions were costing U.S. chip companies like NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel approximately $12 billion in lost revenue every single year. And what did the U.S. get for that $12 billion? According to the study, it delayed China by roughly 6 months. 6 months. That is a terrible return on investment. So the Commerce Department made a pragmatic decision. They eased the restrictions. But they did it in a very specific way. The new rule allows exports of chips with performance below 200 trillion operations per second, or TOPS. That is roughly the performance of NVIDIA's H20 chip, which is a deliberately downgraded version of their high-end hardware. In other words, the U.S. is now explicitly allowing the export of chips that are good enough for civilian AI applications, autonomous driving, cloud computing, industrial automation, not good enough for training the next generation of frontier models. But here's the catch. The H20 chip was not created by accident. It was the result of secret negotiations between NVIDIA and Chinese cloud giants like Alibaba and Tencent in early 2026. NVIDIA realized that if they did not offer a legal, downgraded product, the Chinese firms would simply buy from Huawei. And once that revenue stream was gone, it would never come back. The eased rule is not just a national security decision, it is a corporate lobbying victory. NVIDIA wanted to keep selling to China, and they got the rule they wanted. This is where the story branches in a way that reveals the deep fracture within the U.S. government. On one side, you have the security hawks. A senior U.S. senator, whose name I will not use here, called the eased rule treason. He introduced a bill to block it, citing intelligence that China still relies on U.S. chip desigs and software, like Synopsys and Cadence. He argued that cutting off software access would cripple China's design capabilities within months. But the problem is that intelligence is already outdated. Dr. Mei Lin's data showed that Chinese firms have been reverse engineering the software for years. They have their own domestic alternatives. They are not as polished, but they work. On the other side, you have the economic pragmatists, led by the Commerce Department and backed by the tech industry. They argue that the U.S. cannot afford to lose the Chinese market entirely. That, if U.S. firms are locked out, Chinese firms will fill the gap, and the U.S. will lose not just revenue, but also the feedback loop that comes from selling into the world's largest AI market. They say the best way to stay ahead is not to blockade, but to compete, to build better chips, faster, and sell them everywhere. And here we must look at history, because this is not the first time the U.S. has tried this strategy. In the 1980s, the U.S. waged a semiconductor trade war against Japan. Japanese memory chips were flooding the market, and the U.S. imposed restrictions, tariffs, and quotas. The result, Japan's memory chip industry boomed. Companies like Toshiba and NEC became global leaders. The U.S. effectively ceded the memory market to Japan for a generation. It took decades for U.S. firms like Micron to claw back market share. The lesson of history is clear. Restrictions often accelerate your competitors' independence. So where does this leave us in May 2026? The U.S. has just made a strategic retreat. It has admitted, implicitly, that the tech war is not winnable through blockade alone. It has chosen to keep U.S. firms relevant in the Chinese market, even as China's domestic industry races ahead. The eased rule is a gamble. It is a bet that by allowing some exports, the U.S. can slow the bleeding, maintain market access, and use the next few years to build something that China cannot easily replicate. But there is a deeper question here, and it is the one that keeps Dr. Mei Lin up at night. She defected because she believed in American technological superiority. She believed that open markets and free competition would always win. But now she watches as the U.S. government, her new employer, chooses to ease restrictions not from a position of strength, but from a position of fear. Fear that the gap is closing. Fear that the next generation of AI chips will be made in Shenzhen, not Santa Clara. Fear that the Sputnik moment they created is now landing on their own heads. The truth is, the U.S. is not just easing restrictions because of a cost-benefit analysis. They are easing them because they have no good options left. The old strategy is broken. The new strategy is untested, and the clock is ticking. So the next time you hear a politician say that U.S. chip restrictions are working, remember Dr. Mei Lin and her coffee mug. Remember the 2 terabytes of data that proved the gap was 2 years, not 5? Remember the leaked memo that admitted the restrictions were backfiring? And remember the quiet PDF that changed the rules on a Tuesday afternoon. The chip war is not over. It has just entered a new phase. And the question is no longer whether China will catch up. The question is whether the United States can run fast enough to stay ahead.